Hello Steelers, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to be talking a little bit about Kriegsspiel and a game that I just recently played. I'll tell you a little bit about Kriegsspiel, give you some background. I'm going to talk about the game that I was involved with, who I was involved with, how I got involved, and also the outcomes of the game, and I'll take you through the various moves that the game took and talk a little bit about it. This is obviously going to be from my perspective. There were 5 other players and 3 umpires, each of which have their perspectives on the game, but I'm just going to talk about it from my perspective. I've looked at their orders and things, so I've got a rough idea of what they were trying to achieve during the game as well. But first of all, what is a Kriegsspiel? Well, it was invented in the 19th century as part of the Prussian military by George Reiswitz, who basically created a way of training officers and soldiers in using tactics, battlefield tactics and movement. And it uses a map, generally a 2D map, but they can be 3D with contours, and they are the units on the map are manoeuvred by umpires according to orders given by the players. So the umpires add a certain amount of fog of war, and of course, because it was developed in the mid-19th century, communications were pretty bad, and you could only tell what was happening when messengers were sent back and forth between units. And sometimes that information would be out of date. It would arrive late. It may not arrive at all. So this is basically what the modern Kriegsspiel version is trying to emulate, is the old 19th century version. The game that we played was set in the mid-19th century, about 1830s I think it was, with 2 fictitious German states, the Blauman and the Rottersland, red and blue of course. And they'd just gone to war, and the idea was that the Rottersland were getting a baggage train from one point to another on the map, and the Blauman, which I was part of the team of, were trying to stop that, and that was basically the scenario of the game. So as I said, the Kriegsspiel uses umpires. You have to pass orders through these umpires when you're not near the rest of your team. In our case, there were 3 members on each team, and they were in different areas of the map, so there was no communication that was easier than getting a messenger to somebody, so you had to send a messenger out to get to someone, and then had to wait for a return messenger coming back to give you an update. On the occasions that we were in the same place, for instance, when we started, I was with one of my subordinates because I was playing the general, the major general, general major. I'll not put my rank up. We were able to speak to each other in the same area because we were in the same town. However, as soon as he moved away, I had to start sending messages. The game that I played was on Discord, which is like a chat room basically, where you can actually add and take away different channels, and you can add people to the different channels, so only certain people can get in and out of or can be in these particular channels. You can put them together so they can only see so much. It was basically brought together by Andy, and I've got the list of names here. We had the players were myself, of course, we had Brian, Dominic, Bob, Tom and Steele, and the 2 other umpires were also David and John. And so there was 9 players in total, and as I say, Andy was kind of coordinating everything, and the 2 other umpires were acting as messengers to pass orders between ourselves and our units on the table, and also, or on the map, and also the other commanders. I was put in charge as the Major General of the Blauman forces, and I had 2 colonels underneath me. We were given a list of the forces that we had, which were basically infantry, cavalry and artillery, and we split those between us. We spent a couple of days before the game in an open channel in Discord discussing the plans that we had. So this was kind of like the night before, sat in an inn having a meal and discussing what we were going to do. And we decided on a strategy which would be basically to try to punch a hole in 3 different parts of their advance. So we wanted a thrust to the north, we wanted a thrust to the south, and myself was going to push the units under my command through the centre and hopefully catch their baggage train somewhere in between where they'd set off. Now obviously we had no idea where the enemy were on the table, on the map. They also had no idea where we were. We had a rough idea, approximately, scouts had pointed out approximately where the baggage train was, and we knew where they were trying to get to which was Rossburg, which was under siege in the north. So we had an idea, a basic idea of where their route may take them, but we had to decide where we thought the route was going to go best and where it wasn't, and how, and as I say, how to split up our forces, and then how best to coordinate those in the field. So we did come up with a plan. As I say, we decided on this. It was all signed off over a couple of days of chatting on Discord. One of the good things about Discord is that you can always go back and actually look at the messages that you've sent to each other, because it's all text based. We did have a chance to be able to talk via the voice channels in Discord, but we decided not to. We thought it's better just to write this stuff down. So we've always got a documented, our responses are all documented there, so we can just go back and check them if need be. We then wrote up our individual orders for the units under our particular command, and then they were all passed on to Andy, who collated them as well. When the game started, Andy and the umpires began moving the units on the table, on the map, dependent on our orders and whatever new orders we were giving out as well. So this is basically how it worked. Relatively simple, you would think, but the problem is, from a point of view as a player, you've only got a certain amount of information. When you play a normal inverted commas war game, you can pretty much see everything on the table. So you can see all the units that you command at least, and you can see most, if not all, of the units of the enemy. Sometimes you may have blinds or areas of ambush and things like that, but you've probably got a good idea of pretty much what the enemy's strength is, where they are. So in that case, you can be pretty aggressive in your attacking when you're moving on a war games table, knowing pretty much what the enemy strength is. You can push in an attack on a certain place. In the Kriegsspiel, I found that I was very much cautious about what we were going to do. We'd set a timetable as to when I would start moving with my column. We were basically waiting for one of my colonels to clear the road ahead of me, and then I was going to set off at a certain time. And we were staggered for that because, you know, logistically we would have just got bogged down on the road. So we decided that we were going to stagger our starting off points. But this also meant as well that I was starting to get reports back of enemy activity that was not only cutting off the road to the north but also to the south as well, which was starting to put a little bit of frighteners in me, because you don't know exactly how much the enemy activity is. You don't know exactly what it is. You know there's something there. I mean, is it a cavalry screen that is just pushing forward and probing your defences? Or is it the actual main thrust of the enemy's attack as well? And not entirely sure. Now, you know, afterwards in the debrief, we worked out, everybody talks about what they'd done, what their plans were. We were able to see what everybody else was talking about in their Discord channel, so it was great for that. But I'll come to that in a bit. But as I say, with the Kriegsspiel, you feel as though you're a little bit more cautious, because you're never entirely sure what was actually going to happen and what you're up against. One other thing I found as well, because obviously the umpires have to collate all the information and then put out the orders to their units, and they talk about what happens, and they're rolling dice and deciding various factors in the background of the game. There were large pauses between me issuing my first orders and then the actual the results of those orders coming back in. I mean, they did flow in quite regularly, but I found, because of the way I'd set up my orders, which was to basically set off at I think it was 8 or 10 o'clock in the morning game terms, that not a great deal was happening. It was quite quiet, and I thought it was just me, but then I looked at the other channels of the other commanders, and in particular on the General Major on the opposite side, and I saw that he also had quite a quiet morning as well, or afternoon in real terms, morning in game terms, because he was so far away from the action. He was just advancing as for his orders, so it was quite nice and quiet. But then also down in the south, we'll come back to this when we talk about the maps, but down in the south where the action was really flaring up, there was quite a lot going on pretty early on. But you know, I noticed that there were large gaps of time in between. This is something I think about for another game when next time I play. I suppose it's quite different playing it on Discord as it is if you're playing it face to face, where you may have a couple of different rooms, and one room where people come in to look at the map and things, and that's where the umpires are, and that's where your orders go. That probably moves a lot faster than it would on Discord, so this is something, you know, I would take into account in the next game. After the game we had a debrief, which I found particularly interesting. I think it must have been the military historian in me. Looking back over the action was interesting, just to see exactly what we had been doing, and also what the enemy had been doing at the same time that we were doing. It was the game was kind of split into about 20-minute portions. So Andy had created maps for each 20 minutes of the game, which I'll put up and I'll talk about those in a bit anyway. But yes, from a military historian point of view, it was quite interesting to see what was happening, and also probably what would get left out of a military history of that particular engagement, or that campaign in particular, the Siege of Rosberg for instance, and some of the smaller cavalry actions, because it would have been lost to the mists of time. You know, some of this stuff probably wouldn't even make it into the history books, and what we had was basically a skirmish which felt, you know, really tense, exciting at times, that you know, like I say, would literally probably be a paragraph in a history of the Blaumann-Rottesland War, as we tried to stop the baggage train and it got through. You know, they were supplied. That was it. That's pretty much how it happened. So that was interesting from that point of view, just to be able to actually look at it and just talk about what decisions led us to do certain things, and also what we were thinking at the time, and how that also forced us to react as well on the field on the day. And ultimately, Kriegsspiel is really more a game about manoeuvre than fighting, although there were flare-ups of military action in the game that we played. The ultimate thing is, if you are able to outmanoeuvre your enemy, then you've pretty much won. The next stage is you just winning them. So that is probably not really seen. And our game wound up within 3 game hours. So we started at 7, and I think it was finished by 10:10. And by that time, quite a lot had happened in various plots of the areas on the map itself, and all condensed in a very small area. So all in all, really, as a game to play, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the experience. As I say, I particularly enjoyed the debriefing at the end and the military history side of it from that point of view. Just to see, you know, how you react to it. I've long wanted to get involved in the Kriegsspiel, so, you know, thank you for Andy and the umpires for setting it up, and thanks to the other players as well for being part of it. However, you know, there's a lot of things that I would do completely differently with hindsight, because it is 2020 vision, and I'd like to try it again. Maybe not that scenario, just any other Kriegsspiel at all. Really, I'd be very happy to get involved with one again, because it was an enjoyable and interesting and quite rewarding experience as well. You know, you can sit down and talk about these things afterwards. You have the war stories, really, and I fell asleep that night thinking about it, because, you know, it was playing on my mind as to what I did, what I would do differently, what happened in various different bits and pieces. So this is the forces as they were set up for the Blaumann. This is our initial intel on the actual game. So all we knew really was where our forces were, centred around Alt-Goldberg. You can see there in the centre, and this is just my sketch map of the initial force. So we were able to separate these between ourselves as the Blaumann forces. We knew that there was an enemy supply train that was trying to get its way all the way to Rosberg. You can see there in the top right. But apart from, and we had an idea of approximately whereabouts it was, just below the Soldinger forest down near Soldingen itself. So that's all we had to go on. So our plan basically was to drive 3 lines of attack through basically through the red roads you can see they're heading east. So the 1st Brigade was to go through Valdau, Sidau and then into Wallig, whilst my brigade, the 2nd Brigade, was to go to Wildungen, then down through Valdau, then Holzen and then down to Thessau eventually, and then hopefully meet the supply truck there, whilst we sent a 3rd Brigade south. That was going to go through Nenwalde, then Kursdorf, Grimma, eventually down to Solingen, and then probably turn north as well if we'd not met the enemy train at any of these points. So this was literally our setup and what we had to go on. This was a situation at 6:20 in the morning, so this was the umpires map, this is what they were working off. We couldn't see any of this, remember. This was just revealed to us in the briefing. You can see that we already had cavalry heading south as quick as they could down to the Seldingen crossroads. However, the enemy that you can see there, the red units, were already getting further north than we were able to at this point. We'd still not set off from Alt Goldberg because of our timetabling. And you can see that the grey supply train is in the bottom there, still sat around Solingen. This would become a bit of a problem for them. They were having a bit of a traffic jam issue at the start of their advance. By 0640 things had moved on slightly. They'd started to get their wagon trains out, but they were putting them on farm roads. You can see there they're kind of getting stuck just outside of Solingen, so they were really pushing east with that to then send it north. We thought they may go through the forest road that you can see with the big white line through the centre of the forest. We thought that was probably going to be their main direction, but as it happens, the Rotslanders decided to go even further east. Their cavalry was already moving into position as well. You can see they're moving a lot quicker than I thought they were, or I thought they would be able to, while we were still sitting in Alt Goldberg waiting really until 8 o'clock to set off. This was the issue, because I think there'd been a bit of a misunderstanding as to what time the actual advance would begin and also what time the game would begin in game hours. So I was still sticking to my timetable of setting off about 9 o'clock from Alt Goldberg to thrust into that centre, but by this time the enemy were pretty much already encircling us. By 0700 not a great deal had changed, because the Rotslanders cavalry were pretty much already in position really as to where their scouting positions were going to be, their screening positions. This map here just has the contours on it, so that's just what Andy had overlaid onto the original 2D map, so now you could actually see where the hills and the rises were. We were still sitting in Alt Goldberg at this point, but the wagon train itself had not moved a great deal further forward. You can see they're still struggling on those small country tracks. However, the traffic jam down at Soldingen seemed to have sorted itself out, and the Red forces were now starting to move further north into their secondary blocking positions. What they'd also done as well is they'd sent a messenger up to Rosberg to send a detachment out from Rosberg. This didn't really play a great deal of part in the game. Just a detachment out to come and meet the advance from them from the north as well. So that is already heading down that road down into the battle area itself. At 7:20, contact had been made by the cavalry patrols down in the south. They were still pushing further west to try to outflank our position, to give the Blaumann an open flank really, and that caused considerable alarm amongst the Blaumann forces in the south. The Blaumann forces in Alt Goldberg were just enjoying the sun at this point, so this is 7:20. We're still enjoying ourselves. This is when I was starting to have arguments with one of the Hussars officers who kept asking if we could get moving. As I said, there are things I would have done differently, and that is one of the things. I probably would have moved a lot quicker than we did. I just didn't estimate the amount of speed and time it would take them to cover these small areas. But as you can see, the Rotslanders are kind of pushing a little bit further forward here as well. Not a great deal of change apart from in that area around the Selden crossroads. The wagon train still struggling ever so slightly to get up those farm tracks, but that's something that didn't halt it too much later on in the game. 7:40. Again, not a great deal has changed here. However, the Rutlanders are starting to move more into their screening positions with the cavalry, so they are now overlooking the sea, Seedorf, you can see there in the centre, and also they're watching those main roads coming down from Wilgenden as well, and in the centre of the map itself. Whilst the infantry and the heavier forces are still moving up slightly to the east, just to get into their positions as well, to create a two-line basically of a defence, a defence in depth for any attacks that we were going to do, which we had yet to do really at this point. 8 o'clock, I gave the order that it was time to start moving. So our 1st Brigade began their movements. They started moving out of Alt-Goldberg and to come down those roads up to Wildungen and then to directly try to drive through the centre of their defences. At this point, we still didn't know what was happening. There is starting to be a bit more of a fight developing in the south, down the Selden crossroads. I had no information whatsoever from our commander down the south, Dom, at this point, since 7:40, and he told me that he contacted the enemy. However, I'd heard nothing else, and I wouldn't hear anything else again for another 2 or 3 hours, so this was causing some considerable alarm, and I thought the main enemy thrust was coming from down there. As it turns out, it was just a small detachment with some artillery attached. By 8:20, our forces had started to move out of Alt-Goldberg. The reason we'd staggered it in the first place was to hopefully to avoid any kind of traffic jam in the small roads, so this was the idea. However, things were really hotting up at this point down at the Selden crossroads. As you can see, there was actually an attack going in by the Blaumann forces against the Rotlanders. The Rotlanders were in a good position and probably would have held this wood, so eventually the Blaumann forces did retreat from this point. But again, I was still getting no information from down south, so I had no idea what was happening. We were now aware that there were enemy cavalry as well around the Seedorf, which is the large pond you can see there in the centre, and I was unsure as to whether this was cavalry scouts or whether this again was another part of the main force of the enemy. They were pretty much in their positions really at this point for that second block and reinforce. The detachments that had come out of Rosberg had also at this point met up with a cavalry detachment from the Rotlanders, so they were the guys in Rosberg knew that there was something on the way, so they were just basically getting ready to hold out. The supply train, as you can see in the bottom right of this, has hardly moved at all, just because of those cart tracks. It was so difficult to get it moving, so many traffic jams, etc. But they are at least heading towards Thessau at this point. By 8:40, we had moved out. Some of our forces, 1st Brigade, had moved out around Seedorf. They were spotting more and more cavalry outposts. Again, this was getting difficult to understand as to what the actual forces were. As the fighting down at Selden crossroads there was just coming to a head around this point as well. This was an attack uphill into woods against artillery batteries and infantry in line. It was never going to happen. However, at least Dominic did give it a good try, and he was fighting against Tom, who is an Irish Army instructor as well, so good work on that. They'd put their baggage, their actual divisional baggage, partway down the main road as well. That's the 2 black lines you can see just on the east edge of the contour map. And this was just there for protection, really, for its own sake. We'd put ours together in our column to take it with us. Again, in future, I would probably do something similar to they did, put it somewhere safe, just out of the way, so that it doesn't get attacked and it's not a part of the actual fighting. 9 o'clock. We were slightly moving a little bit further now. I was starting to push my main column, the number 1 up there in the top. You can see heading up to Wildungen. The reason I was heading up there is because I was taking the main roads. I was going to turn at the crossroads there and then head straight down south to Setzau, and that was my plan of attack really. If I hadn't contacted any enemy by that point, which is probably unlikely anyway, I would have turned north up to Stocken and then up towards Rosberg. As you can see, the fighting down at the Selden crossroads had almost petered out, with the Blauman forces retreating slightly back to the main town down there, and they were starting to take cover in there because they were still getting shelled. The cavalry that you can see sitting on the road just north of the Selden crossroads were stopping all messages coming through to the north. So as I say, the last thing I'd heard from the south was at 7:40, nearly an hour and a half earlier now, and I still had no idea what was happening at that point, whether they'd been overwhelmed. This is what I was thinking, was that they'd met a larger force of the enemy and they'd been overwhelmed. So this is why messages were getting through. What it was largely because they had cavalry sitting on that on the roads that the messengers were trying to take, the most direct route. So this was an issue for them as well as for me. 9:20, I had reached the T-junction crossroads, if you will, to Wildungen, and I was going to start turning south down towards the main area of the Rotslanders area. We also were pushing forward as well a little bit further through those cavalry screens. We dispatched some of the hussars to go and deal with those, and we're pushing them back. That was the point. They were supposed to only last just to scout, and also just to move back as soon as they had any enemy contact anyway, so they were working. The fighting was still going on down at Seldingen. Not much has changed there. However, you can see that the train of baggage has moved further north and has now reached Thessau, so that was going to head further south. It's speeding up on that big main road at least. And the rest of their units were now in good positions. They had infantry units meeting up with the Rosberg detachment and were starting to gather up in that top northeast area, which would have blocked us getting through to Rosberg anyway. And then, because the game was taking a while from the umpire's point of view, they jumped it forward to 10 o'clock. This is 1000 hours. And we basically skipped out a couple of turns just to try to wrap things up a little bit at this point. I had started to come south on the main road. We were pushing forward. The large infantry units, large massive infantry over there on the road to Rosberg had been spotted by our forward units in the 1st Brigade. So I was getting reports back from there telling me that there was a large enemy contingent sitting on that road. I was unsure as to whether this was the main enemy thrust still, and I was still under the impression that it was coming from the south, because again I'd still not heard anything from the southern units, simply because they just couldn't get through that through the cavalry screen. They had retired back into the closest town and were sitting there taking fire from the horse artillery. It wasn't for another 10 minutes that I would get another message from them, actually telling me what was happening. So things were a little bit of a mess on our part at this point. We should have been a lot further forward. The train, you can see the baggage train is heading up to Stocken. A few more hours and it would have reached Rosberg quite easily, even down those farm tracks. And then the final move was 10:20. I was now on that main road heading straight down to Thessau. I would have smashed straight into the enemy infantry gathered about halfway down that you can see, so that would have led to another combat. We were also pushing, 1st Brigade was also pushing out towards Rosberg as well, and their infantry was falling back again as a screen, really, to protect that baggage rather than to actually engage us as an enemy. We were also blocked down at Selding crossroads. They were hunkered down in the village down there rather than actually doing anything. So the only force we had was the main infantry force that I was leading down that central line that was probably able to do anything. It was pretty mobile at this point. However, the enemy baggage train had already got past us. They were at Stocken at this point. They would have reached Wallig probably in the next half hour, and then straight on to Rosberg, resupplying them there. So overall, it was a blue loss, a close one though. And interestingly, it was interesting to see afterwards, as I say in the briefing, what had actually happened during the fighting and also just during the manoeuvre. whilst we were playing, and we were completely out of communication with what was happening in the south. So thank you for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. As I say, this is kind of a bit of a ramble on my part just about the game that I played recently. If I do more Kriegsspiels, I will put them up as videos on here and do debriefs myself as well. And so, as I say, thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It's down there somewhere. Give me a like, give me a comment, tell me if you've played any Kriegsspiels, what you got out of them. And keep watching Storm of Steel, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.